We'll wait till 5 after.
That's fine.
Yeah.
You mean, either they'll get comfortable enough to move up a row,
Good talk, I'll do it.
they're pretty comfortable. We should put the
My
donuts
teeth
in front.
don't.
That would lower them. Is this the order?
Yeah.
Larry, is this the order?
Yeah, on that sheet, yeah, that's the order, yeah.
Much better.
Break the law. No, good luck.
It's funny. Oh, well.
I've been working on feasibility analysis for a microbrewery, the entire pool. Yep. Here's something from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm working on a feasibility analysis.
But I
I already
got copy.
Yes. I don't, well, I mean,
Some better.
Where's the continuous edition?
I think the guy was looking at. And they have the 2,700 build one, which I think is my oil paper. But I'm also thinking there's 1,000 word one, analyze any modern political issue. So I think I'll probably look at it this one.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, 7 classes. 7 classes.
Rick, we have art. I didn't know what you knew. That's always nice
It's
to know.
Photoshop, basically. Let's do that. It's not any of this, which is horrible. I tried. It didn't work. No, let's just
Are
do
you,
the.
is everyone going to stay here and talk, or are they getting going up here and talk?
I'm gonna walk over.
Yeah, I'm gonna walk up too.
Okay, so if I take the post, we're at 2 minutes left.
Let's do it. Till we slide toes.
I'm gonna go with that.
Suck.
I was,
Let me
I
double check
realized
when
when I was
figure out
writing
what
this,
is
our wall.
Oh,
Yeah, very useful.
I got lucky, I was able to.
I think I have resources.
counteract
Some are wall.
studies and a poli sci anyway, because it's global studies and.
I took the wrong medicine this morning. I took the one that puts me to sleep instead of it, so I had to take a 4-hour nap. I was just running out of the room. I was already tired.
Just ready for you. That's it. 4 hours of good discussion and debate.
Plenty of time. No, we practiced in the car.
Really?
So you get even more.
We all sang in the car.
That's awesome.
Great.
Yeah, it was unintentional. It actually came on random. So like that.
Okay. I feel like that's the one song I still have no idea how it goes.
It's fun. That's from how long? Are you serious? That's
Good?
Yes, yes. Let's show it.
Yes. Well, welcome everyone to the first History Club function. Is that correct? I believe that's correct. Of the year. I'm Dr. Schneider, chair of the History Department, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this event and for this wonderful and interesting panel. We have 4 speakers today. Dr. Larry Simpson, professor of history, and we have Jordan Cohn, senior history major, We have Dr. Scott Ingham, Professor of Criminal Justice and Pre-Law Advisor, and we have Jay Bergen, a freshman student in history here. So it should be an interesting panel. I imagine that there will be discussion also. This will be interactive as well. What do you think, 3-4 hours we should be done?
Yeah.
All right. Well, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Larry Simpson. How many of you are victims of Dr. Simpson? Okay, so he is, I'll give a little introduction. He is an expert in Middle East and Africa, and has spent his early years after college and before a professor. And we can't really talk too much about it because he'd have to kill you. But I don't know how many of you know, but he actually was in Air Force Intelligence and NSA, so he has all of your conversations taped, and served in the Eastern Mediterranean, so he sort of knows something about the Middle East after the Ottomans. So.
Eventually we get past the Ottomans too. Okay, well, I have to tell you guys, thank you for being here, and I apologize right off the bat because I came with my briefcase full of everything but my notes for what I was going to talk about here. But I think maybe we can wing it a bit here, if you will. I really want to set up for the other panel members, give a little bit of a historical perspective on where Syria fits in with what's the current events in the Middle East. But as a historian, I kind of want to take us back and tell us that I can see the roots to what's going on in Syria going back to especially the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. What I would say is the region, what's going on in the region as a whole is a kind of identity crisis as the regimes and the peoples are in search of legitimate identities that they can ascribe to, whether it is, and there have been a number of solutions, whether everybody should come together as an Arab. Some of you guys who've had my Middle East class know some of the problems with that for Iranians or Turks, but are we like all one people as Arabs? Are we all, say, Muslims? So religion's been an answer for that, or is maybe our identity more particularistic? Are we Egyptians? Are we Iraqis? Are we Syrians? These are the kinds of issues that there's a lack of consensus, and hence there's the upheavals in the Middle East. With this kind of lack of consensus, what has been consistent in the Middle East in the era since the Second World War has been that there have been essentially authoritarian leaders controlling strong states, relatively strong states, with coercive apparati to keep the populations in check. Where we begin to see a kind of change, and really it's a global, is at the end of the Cold War. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was what many would call a first wave of democratization that occurred throughout the world, liberalization, whatever word you want to use for that. What was striking about it was it did not hit the Middle East like it hit, say, Eastern Europe or Africa. The first time you really see a kind of maybe a hint of where the change was going to come, and I'm kind of following Kanan Makia, a famous Iraqi historian on this, is with the Gulf War. And when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Saddam, by doing that, was actually challenging the international system in the Middle East, claiming it was a kind of colonial construct, if you will, and that Kuwait was part of Iraq. Of course, the United States and a coalition responded to that. And that response, in another sense, was like a challenge to authoritarian Republican kind of regime, which had profound repercussions, but not so immediate. Now, Saddam, of course, was defeated in that first Kuwait war, and we saw a kind of beginnings of sense of breakaway from authoritarianism with the uprisings amongst the Shia in southern Iraq. This is about the time a lot of you guys were born, I'm afraid, and in the north amongst the Kurds. Saddam, of course, ruthlessly suppressed those. The Bush administration didn't come to their aid. And the 1990s were basically a period where you have authoritarian regimes kind of ratcheting down, keeping their population in check. There were a couple of significant events in the Middle East that kind of presaged the kinds of upheavals today. In 1992, there were elections in Algeria. Islamists, meaning people who follow political Islam, were the winners of that election, but the military authoritarian government there, authoritarian seems to be my word today, by the way, clamped down on that, and a terrible civil war followed. If we were to move a little bit further to the east, to Sudan, I would note that Sudan, which had had trouble since its independence in '56, also in the 1990s was faced a number of upheavals. That's okay, guys. In both cases, though, the regimes were able to stifle dissent by using military methods. And I would say that basically the Bush administration and the Clinton administration remain kind of keep the status quo in the Middle East, and putting democracy is better for rhetoric than for actual reality. Where you see changes starting to come is at the beginning of the next century. Now I'll note Syria, since that is supposed to be our main topic. Syria in 2000, 2001, actually we would forget about it now, but many thought that a revolution was coming to Syria then, or a fundamental change, because the old ruler, Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, the present ruler, died, and there was an attempt in Syria, a kind of Syrian, it's called the Damascus Spring. And if I ask you to raise your hands, how many remember the Damascus Spring? I think maybe even up on the panel we won't remember it, because it was short-lived. The Bashar, who had studied in London, everyone thought he was, well, since he studied in the West, he was therefore a liberal or something, put short work to such, or shortly put an end to such kinds of ideas, shut down any of those attempts at liberalization in Syria. Where we begin to see other major changes occur, of course, 9/11, and then the U.S. involvement in Iraq, the invasion, U.S.-led with the coalition of the willing, or however we want to call it, which brought about the end of Sodom. And while most would not, in the Middle East, would want to recognize this as something as Middle Easterners didn't like it, that Americans, foreigners were coming in, even if we brought what Fuad Ajami, famous political scientist, historian, calls the foreigner's gift, even if we did bring with us elections in Iraq and movements that kind of reform, that they liked that, but they didn't like the instrument by which it was brought. But I think it is a turning point, because it was, people in Syria would joke in 2005 when there were people lining up to vote in Damascus. Those people who were lining up to vote were Iraqis participating in an Iraqi election. The Syrians hadn't seen a free election since the late 1940s, and I don't think it went, without their notice, to say the least. That kind of change, and Bush, of course, as the main rationale for invading Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, but amongst the many reasons he gave, or pretext of view, dissent from his reasons, was the idea of democratization, spreading a kind of freedom agenda in the region. That maybe sounded good, and many people, especially what we call the neoconservatives, saw that as what should be the object of American policy. But the immediate kind of result of that was, well, where we did see an election occur, it was in the Palestine Authority and the group Hamas, which most of us would describe as a terrorist group, support terrorist actions, won in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and that didn't seem to presage very good for future elections. And the fact, of course, of the civil war that developed in that country kind of fundamentally discredited that in the minds of most. Americans lost blood and treasure in Iraq, not to mention Afghanistan, and most of us wished to disengage. But I think it's fair to say that in the Arab world, and even the broader world, Iran and Turkey, they were taking note. Israel actually would be the one exception where there actually was a functioning democracy. And it wasn't long before you see in 2009 in Iran what was elections for the president, which most saw as being fixed. I'm watching my time here. How much do I have?
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay.
Because Tim interrupted you. So.
Okay. We see a green movement, which the U.S. didn't come to support, unfortunately, and the authoritarian, again, regime in Iran was able to hold on. But at the very same time, just days before that happened, we had Barack Obama, who had been a critic of Bush, go to Cairo and make a speech where he talked about a new policy in the Middle East. And strikingly, when he did so, he invited members of the Muslim Brotherhood to sit in the front row. It was an illegal organization. And there he brought them to the fore, and what we have is that was an embarrassment to the Mubarak government. To make a long story very short here, as I'm running out of time, what would happen in the wake of that is, took most experts as a surprise, kind of obscure events. December 2010 in Tunisia, incident with a man who was selling vegetables and pushed around by the authorities. He decided to kill himself as kind of protest against the restrictions of the regime. That was a spark that started in Tunisia and has spread all through the region. With my time at the end, if we want to talk about other places, we can. I'll just tell you that Syria was a latecomer to the so-called Arab Spring, and the rebellion there broke out in March of 2011 when Libya and Egypt and other places were already very hot, and it really came from the authorities torturing and killing some boys who had put up anti-regime slogans, graffiti on walls. From that minor event, the estimate is today 115,000 people have died in the Syrian civil war. So I'll let the others pick up and actually take you into the war itself. Thanks.
Alright, hey everyone, my name's Jordan Cohen. Thanks a lot for coming to this event. I know as the History Club we've been working on this for quite a while, and it's really nice to see such kind of a big audience, and really looking forward to hear how you guys feel about it. So the title of my presentation is called Geopolitical Importance of the Conflict in Syria and Why the United States Cannot Afford to Mess Up. The Syrian civil war is empowering Iran and Hezbollah. This is because the Syrian military on its own is incredibly ineffective. This played a part in the US calculus not to intervene in the conflict, especially early on. Throughout this conflict, the military has shown a significant inability to hold land. One key area where this is abundantly clear is the city of Ghouta. Ghouta is a rebel stronghold right on the outskirts of Damascus, and according to Michael Doran, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, very near where Iranian support enters the country. Yeah. Anyways, after a year of attempting to capture the rebels' forces at Ghouta, Assad's government, on August 21st, 2013, utilized chemical weapons against the city and population. To demonstrate how awful the Syrian military actually is, they still have been unable to take control of said location, even following the horrors wreaked by the chemical weapons. So that's kind of a brief example about why this military on its own is pretty ineffective. So let's look at what happens once it gets help from outside sources. The most effective battle on the part of the Syrian military occurred at Al-Qusayr in late May. In this conflict, the military was reinforced by Hezbollah fighters who came from Iran and used weapons also coming from Iran as well as Russia. In this battle in late May, the Syrian rebels were crushed. Essentially, without the aid of Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, the Syrian military stood no chance at surviving this conflict in the long run. Unfortunately, Washington's decision not to intervene has emboldened these groups. According to Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Vali Nasser, quote, Syria has shown Iran to be the only regional actor capable of successfully running a war in another country, and one with which it does not share a border. Iran has given the Assad regime money and weapons, deployed fighters in Syria, and created a regional alliance with the Shiite government in Iraq and its proxy militia in Hezbollah and Lebanon, all for the purposes of helping Syria. End quote. This increased authority from Iran can be seen when their new leader, Hassan Rouhani, said his country is in a unique position to broker a resolution in the evolving conflict. Overall, In the US calculation not to intervene for the majority of the conflict, they correctly assumed that the Syrian military, by itself, was not strong enough to win. However, support from Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah strengthened the Syrian military, thus preventing the rebellion from ever getting close to toppling Assad. Furthermore, Iran, perhaps America's gravest threat in the region, has become even stronger and more well-entrenched because of the US failure to act in this conflict. On the other hand, though, by toppling Assad's government, Iran and Hezbollah would become isolated. If the clerical country has no allies in the region, it will be significantly more likely to curb its nuclear program, particularly when influenced by America, Kuwait, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, all enemies of the Iranian regime and to an extent the Syrian regime in power. Regrettably, the persistent inaction by Obama's administration has prevented this from happening. And as of yesterday, Saudi Arabia stated that they will reassess relations with the United States because, in the words of Prince Bandar, former Saudi ambassador to Washington, the US has failed to take any effective action on Syria. So it's really rare for me to agree with someone from Saudi Arabia, especially when they're dissing American leadership. So you're witnessing history here. But Prince Bandar's right. So anyways, this leads me to my next point. Iran and Russia are playing chess, while the United States is engaging in a rousing bout of diplomatic monopoly. An article in the Asia Times states that, quote, Americans see individual pieces of geopolitical real estate like hotels on the monopoly board, while the Russians look at the interaction of all their spheres of interest around the globe. Furthermore, the article goes on to compare Putin to a strategic chess player engaging with an inferior opponent. They say his goal is to, quote, create complications without an immediate strategic objective in order to provoke blunders from the other side and take opportunistic advantage, end quote. Russia's involvement in Syria is based on their geopolitical and strategic interest to maintain an ally in the region, most notably one that opposes the United States. Therefore, the risks of this conflict threaten to vitalize America's worst enemies throughout the world. By choosing not to become involved in this conflict, Washington risks destabilizing a significant portion of the region. The first reason for this destabilization is religious radicalization. In September, Aaron Zellin, scholar at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and director of the website Jihadology, estimates that less than 10% of the rebel groups are Islamic radicals. Furthermore, in a Wall Street Journal article from last month, Elizabeth Obegi, a journalist who had spent substantial time in Aleppo and Damascus, also argues that most of the rebels, she states, are somewhere between 80 to 90% completely moderate and not extremist. So those numbers match up. Nevertheless, as Washington continues to be detached, the moderate Syrian rebels eventually join with the al-Nusra Front in order to gain success in the war. For those of you who don't know, the al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State of Sham, or ISIS, are fueled by Islamist doctrine and hope to create an Al-Qaeda eventually, or a Syria ruled by Al-Qaeda. Towards late September, 11 moderate rebel groups joined these organizations, not because they agreed with the ideology of these factions, but because Al-Qaeda fighters had better weapons and were generally more victorious than any rebel groups either not supported or supported in the bare minimum by the United States. If this continues, by not supporting the rebel groups in Syria, the United States is creating two possible options. The first is a Syria continually being controlled by Iran, who is Israel's gravest threat in the region and is a very big threat to the United States as well. Or the second is one controlled by Al-Qaeda. Because neither of these options seem to be that preferable to one another, it's my belief that the US needs to get involved, at least to some extent, in the Syrian conflict to arm the moderate rebels. The second reason the Syrian conflict is destabilizing the region is because of issues regarding Syrian refugees. In Lebanon, Syrian refugees make up 21% of the country's population. A report from the World Bank states that these displaced persons caused Lebanon's real GDP growth to decrease by 2.9 percentage points each year of the conflict, pushing 170,000 Lebanese civilians into poverty. Furthermore, the influx of Syrian refugees is also expected to increase labor by between 30 and 50%, leading to massive rates of inflation. In regards to other non-economic factors, the Syrian conflict is expected to put significant strain on the Lebanese health and education systems. According to the Daily Star, one of Lebanon's major newspapers, the conflict has eroded these bureaucratic organizations. The World Bank reported that the estimated cost of health, education, and social safety nets in Syria following the beginning, or in Lebanon following the beginning of the Syria conflict was between $308 million to $340 million, while $1.4 billion to $1.6 billion would be needed just to restabilize Lebanon as a country. This is clearly a massive amount of money, and is the result of the conflict exiling Syrian civilians. Therefore, the bad situation in Lebanon stemming from Hezbollah's role in leadership is deteriorating at a much more significant rate because of the civil war occurring in their neighbor's country. In addition, Jordan and Turkey, who are also neighbors to Syria, are facing the same economic and bureaucratic issues. In sum, Syria plays a vital geopolitical role throughout the world. This is seen in Syria's close relation to Western foes, aka Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. Syria also, this conflict has the potential to spread terrorism throughout the region, and furthermore, the destabilization this conflict has caused in other Middle Eastern countries is significant throughout the region as a whole. So, just overall, this is really why I believe the U.S. has a positive role to play in this conflict, and if we don't, I think things could get really bad, even worse than they are now, really fast. Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, my thanks to Jordan for setting this up and having me here. I'm sort of the non-historian of the group, so I'll certainly bring a slightly different perspective. As close as I get is legal history, so I'll try at least to tie some legal history into this overall. I think, too, Jordan set this up just perfectly because in his talk he's sort of begging the question, well, why doesn't the government of the United States do anything, right? Why doesn't the president respond to what's going on in Syria? And what I wanted to address are basically the president's legal options, right? Why doesn't he not respond, right? Politically, it sounds like it's a good idea, but what can he legally do? And I want to make sure I emphasize that legal construct, right? He can certainly act and then try and justify it later, but one of the costs is the legal end of things, right? There's going to be legal consequences, whether it's international law, whether it's U.S. law. The president is bound to act and uphold the laws of the United States and the Constitution, right? That's his primary duty. And so the question we need to ask is, what is the law here, right? What law governs this situation? Does law even govern the situation? And so it comes from basically two primary sources that have to be blended together and mixed together. The first is U.S. law, right? U.S. law, supreme law of the land, the Constitution. We also have statutes that have been passed by Congress that allow the president to do certain things and prohibit him from doing others. And then we have judges who will look at specific cases and make decisions, and these things become law, and the U.S. government has to act in accordance with that. So that's from the U.S. side, but then we have the international side, right? We've got the United Nations. The United Nations, as a collection of nations from across the world, has a say in what the United States can and cannot do. They have a right to intervene in the situation themselves. The United States serves in a very powerful position within the UN Security Council. The United States is also engaged in treaties, right? We have agreements with other countries to do certain things in certain situations that we have to recognize. And finally, we have common practice, right? We have, what do nations do? How do they interact with each other? Syria, regardless of who's in control, is still a sovereign state, and that has to be recognized. So we're sort of left with, in this context, what are our options, right? What can we do from our legal standpoint? And I want to run through some, and these are certainly not exhaustive, but they sort of are the ones that have been proposed of various factions, both within the United States and around the world. Right? The first is simply do nothing. Right? We can sit back as passive observers, be isolationists, and sort of watch what happens in Syria and say, oh, well, that's Syria. Right? see what happens there. Historically, that's been the U.S. response to things, right? That's sort of our natural tendency. You can go all the way back to George Washington, right? Don't get involved in foreign affairs. U.S. staying out is the desired policy. It wasn't until the Second World War that that idea began to change, that we started looking and said, you know, we need to be a little more international in our thinking. We can be attacked from outside of our borders. We never thought that until World War II. And so we have to realize that, you know, our default response is sort of do nothing. We could also do simply economic aid, right? There's need to assist in Syria. Jordan talked about the refugee problem, right? Simply supplying Lebanon and Turkey with financial aid may ease some of those pressures. However, we have a problem with that from the U.S. standpoint, right? The president just can't spend money at will. The president can't say, oh, I'm going to give Turkey this money, or I'm going to go give Lebanon this money, or I'm going to go give the Syrian resistance this money, because as Jordan pointed out, right, we've got al-Nusra sitting there. So what are we going to do? Are we going to give al-Qaeda essentially money to go and, you know, overtake Syria? Well, we have a crime called material support of terrorism. That's essentially what they're going to be doing if they give money to the Syrian resistance. So that's really not a viable option. What's been used for the most part is diplomatic pressure, right? But we have to back that up with something, right? We can go in and negotiate, which is what we've done over to chemical weapons, but as we saw in that dispute, Russia sort of held the upper hand in all of that. They had the influence in Syria, they had the influence with al-Assad to get him to do what the government wanted, and the only thing that we had backing up our diplomatic pressure was the military. Right? If you don't do this, we're going to invade. And so that sort of brings us to our next area, which is criminal justice, right? Well, we could go in, we could send a small force in, and we can go and take the people out who are causing the problems. That's not historically unprecedented. In the 1980s, the United States went down to Panama, sent the military into Panama, and arrested the president of Panama and brought him back to the United States for prosecution for drug distribution. So we could simply go in and do that. Another aspect we could employ is going to the International Criminal Court and saying, look, you know, the Assad government, we have evidence that they have used chemical weapons. That's a war crime, right? That's a crime against the Code of International Criminal Justice. The problem is the U.S. isn't a member of the International Criminal Court. Right? We're afraid that we may get prosecuted in the International Criminal Court, so we stay out of it. So it's kind of hard to get them to do our work there from a legal standpoint. So that leaves us with the military. Right? I've sort of knocked down these other four options pretty quickly because the military is the most complicated in terms of the law. Right? It's very easy for people in the media, for different pundits to come in and say, look, let's just use military force. The problem is we have a whole collection of law that governs when the military can and cannot be used. Right? Start at the very top, the U.S. Constitution. Right? Article 1, Section 8 says only Congress can declare war. However, Article 2, Section 2 says the President is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So if the President wants to use the armed forces and the Congress says no, who wins? Or if Congress hasn't declared war, can the President use the armed forces? Right? We have not had a declaration of war since 1941. Can you think of any instances where armed forces have been used since then? How does that happen? Right? How can the President use the armed forces without a declaration of war? Well, in the 1960s, we had a little conflict in Vietnam, right? It was rather unpopular. And so what followed from that was Congress said, look, we need to rein in the President's power to use the military. And they passed something called the War Powers Resolution. Of course, it passed over the President's veto, but it became law nonetheless. And while the constitutionality of it is somewhat dubious, it is still essentially what governs the President's use of armed forces. And it requires congressional notification if the president wants to use the armed forces. He has to go to Congress and say, I want to use the armed forces in this particular situation. And so, if he fails to do that, right, he violates the law. And what happens if Congress says no? Then what do we do, right? We have a rather significant constitutional crisis. And the law says that if the president initiates armed forces, if they're not out in 60 days and Congress doesn't authorize it, we've got another problem. We're in violation of law. And so you had to get Congress to authorize the use of military force. And that's what was happening in August and September. The Obama administration had gone to Congress and said, look, we have evidence of chemical weapons, authorize military force. Well, the votes in Congress weren't there. And you know, from the budget situation we've had all through October, right, Congress and the president don't get along real well right now. And so getting them to agree to use force in Syria was rather a problem. So the only basis right now that the U.S. has to use military force in Syria is one authorization for the use of military force, and that came after September 11th. Congress has authorized military force in order to go after anyone who is involved in the September 11th attacks and any associated forces. Well, that's Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra maybe, but how do you justify al-Nusra being part of Al-Qaeda? Yeah, we got links to them, and they're certainly designated a foreign terrorist organization, but is that they weren't in existence on September 11th, 2001. How do you tie them to that use of military force? So that's our big problem that we have at this point, is how do we use military force from a legal standpoint in the United States? All right, and I haven't even really touched on international law. If you want to ask a few questions afterwards, I can fill in that. But the point is, right, it's easy to criticize the Obama administration's inaction. The problem is, really, he doesn't have too many legal options that he can pursue.
So I'm Jay Bergen. I love history and just military strategy. It's my first time doing this. I'm a little scared, so just bear with me here. I've done a lot of research on Iraq War, Gulf War, and just strategy in general, and how the U.S. would be, in my opinion, making a grave mistake by even involving in Syria. First thing is that there are a couple options that the U.S. has for military involvement. They can go with, they can go and use bombers and take out the chemical weapons, try to take out the government facilities and military facilities, high-profile targets. Problem with that is, one, if a chemical weapons truck is traveling, or you bomb the base, would that set off the weapons? If the truck is going through a populated area, would that cause another chemical attack? Who would be linked to that? The Syrians or the U.S.? The second thing is that if you were to bomb, say, a building that a member of the administration would be in hiding in, well, in the I think it was in the Iraq War, or in the Gulf War, but the U.S. bombed, used stealth bombers and bombed a building that was supposed to contain members of the government, but they contained all civilians. They were all killed, like massive casualties. So, and that was huge political backlash, and that prompted that further pushed that was the Gulf War. That pushed the U.S. to invade, using their ground forces. So, from the air, drone strikes, there's a lot of risk for civilian casualties, and the U.S. just can't go there right now. Second, if Obama has said that we won't send in troops on the ground. We've already had Vietnam, Korea, the Iraq War. People just don't want that. If we were to go into that, it would have to be house-to-house fighting and room-to-room. Going into places like Aleppo and Damascus. Right now there are snipers shooting at people in the streets. Just a recent report there was that they were targeting pregnant women and kids, about 10 years old and aiming for the head in most targets. They're just using terror and hate tactics. And if the U.S. was to walk in, first they'd become under fire by these snipers, and they can't just fire a rocket at one of the buildings. There could be a family next door. Because everybody's, especially in Aleppo, people have moved out, they've fled into Turkey, and it's just, some of this, it's just abandoned there, but there are still people in there. People have to run from the rebel side to the regime side for food and supplies. Men have to cross this kind of no man's land because there are supplies and food in the rebel-held side of Aleppo, but they live in the regime side and they can't move their families. So there would be, so it's not feasible for the U.S. to one, put boots on the ground and take the time to go and room to room, house to house, when it would take so long, and it would just give the regime time to fight back. Another thing is, if the U.S. was to send weapons to the rebels, my point of view is that they should have done this earlier, but now it won't be feasible, like Jordan said, because the Al-Nusra Front is operating in that area. And like in Libya, some of those weapons have reported to end up in terrorist hands that they gave to Libyan rebels. So using that approach would just be a huge backlash against the administration, and it's not what they're looking for right now. And the international community has also expressed just that they're not committing to anything at all right now. And when Obama wanted to attack Syria, the British Parliament voted no, which is a main pressure for Obama to back off because Britain and Israel are one of our biggest allies in that region. There's been huge diplomatic pressure on them, the Arab League, European Union, and everybody, but the United Nations hasn't condemned the fighting because Russia and China won't. Russia has trade relations with Syria. I believe it's arms, and Russia gets a lot of money from Syria for their weapons. So Russia has just been put a block on everything, and until this chemical weapons treaty. The chemical weapons treaty, I believe, is just the worst thing ever because Assad can just hide some of his weapons and use them again. It's still not gonna solve anything. He can deliver half his arsenal and still keep half stored away. Nobody knows how many he has or where they have them. And it's just not getting anywhere. And then you have Israel that has already made missile strikes into Syria, and it's just a mess there because U.S. is allied with Israel, Iran is allied with Syria, and it's just a bottleneck in that region. There was the Obama administration told the Israelis to back off after they attacked the Hezbollah convoy in Syria that was supposedly carrying chemical weapons. They told them to back off. You can't do that. It's not. We want to keep this calm and not antagonize Iran any further. Another thing is that if the U.S. does not pressure does not send in aid or anything or make a statement against the Syrians, there's the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is can I show you the map?
Yeah, you can probably click on it.
So we have Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman. They're the Gulf Cooperation Council. They've also condemned the violence, and Saudi Arabia is getting annoyed with the United States already on their lack of support. And if the other nations follow suit, there's a major risk for the U.S. because I believe it's their third fleet has a base in Bahrain, which is a small island right here. And so if diplomatic relations are frayed with Bahrain, then the U.S. has lost a major military presence in that area because they can strike Tehran from the base and anywhere in Iran. So it's So that situation there is very fragile because Saudi Arabia is a huge player in that region, and if the rest of those nations follow suit, it's not going to work out well for the U.S. or anybody else. How much time do I have?
30 seconds.
Well, that's all I had.
Okay, thank you. All right, I guess are we opening it up for questions? We open it up for questions. Not everybody wants. If no questions, then I'm going to ask Jack.
I guess this is from a historical perspective, a little farther back than was touched on, but how do you feel that the different ethnicities or sort of various identifications that the Syrian people have, say the Shiites and Sunnis, if they're involved, or different tribal allegiances, helps or hinders either the rebels or the government?
To whom are you asking the question?
Everyone's.
Everyone?
Yeah, so I guess my knowledge of that comes from Fuad Ajami's book, The Syrian Rebellion. And he really talks about that there are these big national differences, especially when you, in sectarianism, especially when you look at like the Alawites, who that's what, and yeah, right, Alawites is
Yes.
Assad, yeah, is what Assad's from versus the majority kind of Sunni population. So Alawites a form of Shiism. And so really what's interesting when, because he does kind of a study of the demographics of the rebellion itself, and what he gets at is that, yeah, there are a lot of different demographics, but at the same time, that rebellion holds their want for Assad out of power kind of more than anything else, at least for right now.
Yeah, just for information, the population in Syria is, I'm not really good with numbers, but probably 75% of the population is Sunni Muslim, and that's most of the opposition is Sunni Muslim, and numbers especially strong is the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi groups that, like Nusra that they were talking about. The Alawis, who've been ruling since the 1960s, are probably 12–13% of the population. So they're a distinct minority, and that part of what's going on there is resentment at being led by them. There are, down in the south, there are the Druze, who are, I think they're probably about 8%, a small, but you know, when you start adding these together, you probably go beyond 100 if I'm not careful. Up in the north, there are Kurds. Again, those are small numbers, and then there is a Christian population there. A couple of those ethnic groups have tried to stay on the sidelines because they would say the Christians prefer the devil they know, if you will, with Assad compared to Muslim Brotherhood and some of the kind of hardline Islamist type stuff. So they've been just trying to sit back. So you got a bunch of the population split on these ethnic lines, and you can do regional splits. If we had a map up that was showing where the rebel groups are, you'll see a coincidence of where the rebel strongholds are on these kinds of ethnic kinds of differences and such. So I mean that's a fundamental part of the problem in Syria and all through the Middle East. These are regimes which, I think I used the word authoritarian before, that refuse to respect any sense of pluralism, and hence we have the rebellions going on. Is that getting to your question?
Yes. But how does that hurt or help or hinder the rebellion itself?
Well, the rebels are, the mainstream are the Muslim Brotherhood. They are the vast majority of the population, so by numbers they have that. The others are, tactical coalitions, if you will. The Christians say, the Kurds certainly resent the regime. They've been oppressed by them. I can't speak so much to the Druze. The Christians have been accepting of it. But what I'm trying to get at is I think you could woo, if there was an opposition that could defang al-Nusra and the hardcore elements, then you would see the Christians coming over to the opposition if there were a more moderate option. And that's what's not being done. There hasn't been, that's how Jordan made reference to that. The U.S., I think, has failed to look, has sat back on the sidelines and allowed the options to be either A, regime, or B, potentially extremist Islamist elements. And there are significant numbers, the numbers are disputed, but there are significant numbers of moderates, and if we were to cultivate that, we might be able to bring across some of these others. I'm not sure that, you know, we can argue that it's too late. We're in the middle of a war. It's certainly very belated, though, I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of touch on the various like radical groups, as I said before, the studies I read suggest it's 5 to 10% Algeria, or 5 to 20%. Al Jazeera, which I did mention in the paper, also has the same record. But to some extent, anyone who claims to know the exact numbers of radicals in the rebellion is kind of full of shit. So,
The scholarly point.
So the thing though is, especially when you look at this Al Jazeera demographic map, there are a lot of groups that are not necessarily as radical as what you see with al-Nusra Front or ISIS. But kind of as I pointed out, the longer we don't do anything, the more likely al-Nusra and ISIS are going to take command of that rebellion.
The U.S. is quickly becoming a really large oil exporter. I believe it just passed Saudi recently. I was wondering what that would do to the dynamics in the region from the perspective of the countries in the Middle East, and how U.S. policy would change in response to that. And Jordan, I know you said that Saudi is thinking about raising prices, which I actually think would be good because it would give us more pricing power in which we could reinvest in the energy renaissance I believe we're having. So is there like any other actions that could be taken?
Regarding oil?
Right, in response to so the prices are gonna fall if we keep exporting.
Yeah.
So what does that change from the country's perspective? The Middle Eastern countries as well as ours. Like how would it change the dynamics?
I mean, if Saudi Arabia raises prices, what, I forgot, I think it was Bloomberg is where I read it this morning, argued was we could have another oil crisis like the 1970s. I find that a little bit difficult to believe, only because now we actually have preparations in advance of something like that were to happen. If you want me to list them, that's another 40-minute presentation, just because I wrote a paper on it. But it's, I don't think it would be that bad. I actually kind of lean towards you. I think there probably could be a little bit of good, because it would give the U.S. more power. I also think kind of the gorilla in the room is that the U.S. has a lot of oil inside the U.S., especially in North Dakota. If we started drilling in North Dakota, we would be energy independent by 2020.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of issues with doing that too, but I think that's kind of the elephant in the room that you get in when you start talking about the what-ifs with oil.
With what you guys have said, referencing the past, what do you see as a likely or multiple different possibilities that may be happening in the next upcoming months to the year with this movement? And where do you see that possibly going?
My understanding is of the internal situation is, I mean, the resistance to Syria really isn't, the Syrian government isn't really getting anywhere. I mean, they're sitting at a stalemate now. So, I mean, I don't see anything, I don't see the U.S. intervening in any way, certainly in the next year or so. So, I wouldn't expect much to change, I would think, unless, again, you have a situation where more chemical weapons are used, or you get some sort of indication that there's a bigger international humanitarian reason for intervening, and so far that hasn't happened.
I would say the tide had been, it's really hard to follow civil war, but the tide had been shifting toward the Syrian side at the time of the use of the chemical weapons, which it doesn't make sense that they used them, but there was an attempt on the life of Assad, and it may have been retaliation for that, by the way, just as an aside. But the tide had been shifting in the way of the regime. I haven't seen anything really stopping that full-blown, and what's also complicating matters is Hezbollah has been intervening in a much increased way. The Iranians have been more bold, if you will, about also supplying the Assad government. So there's been a lot of tilt that way. Covertly, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks as well have been supplying the opposition. I happen to be on a group with a bunch of former Syrian linguists on Facebook kind of thing, private group, and the guys, follow flights coming out of, you can follow them on public domain, flights originating out of Bahrain, such. There are constant flights going up into, say, Jordanian airfields up in the north, and it's clear that the Saudis and the others are supplying. The problem is who they supply are not necessarily the moderates. I don't know whether that's, I'm afraid that it's slipping into back to the regime's side right now, and while we remain focused on a very narrow question, namely chemical weapons, we're losing sight of the fact that people are dying by it. Chemical weapons have killed, what, 1,400 people? That's what, 115,000 dead. We get a perspective on, maybe it's a mistake to focus on that heinous weapon. But when you die by a bullet, you can die just as painfully as you can from a chemical weapon. Nice thought.
One aspect that I found really interesting about this discussion was we're really focused on the question of what we should do, but the other question that we haven't really addressed, well, that was addressed very briefly, is what we can do, and that's going back to what we're legally allowed to do. And I'm not going to pretend to know a lot about it, but based on what was discussed today, it seems that our hands are very much tied, and it's certainly easier to do nothing from a legal aspect than to try and do something. But there's obviously a lot of support that there could be a lot of benefit to going in and doing something. So I guess if I paint a hypothetical for a second and say that we wanted to go in, and I don't know what the collective we actually means, but we did, what would be, I'm not going to say the legal way, but the path of least resistance, and what sort of hoops would we have to jump through? And I'm actually kind of curious to hear from like a couple of different people.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and that's why I emphasize sort of the legal means of doing it. There's always the illegal means of doing it. And sort of the historical example, one of my favorite quotes was from the early 90s, Clinton administration. They're debating whether, they have this guy called Osama bin Laden that they found out about. And they know where he is. And they have this opportunity to go get him. And the Clinton administration is debating, right? Do we go do this, do we not? Because, we don't have any legal justification to go do this. And Vice President Al Gore walks into the Oval Office in the middle of the debate, and they ask him, they say, Al, what do you think we should do? And he goes, well, this is a no-brainer. Of course it violates international law, but that's why it's covert. Go get him. And of course he didn't carry the day. They decided not to go get him, and we see what ultimately happens. And so, there's certainly covert ways of doing things, and I have no doubt that there are things going on still that we don't know. And so that's always, the most difficult part. And sort of the follow-up from the legal perspective is, you say send somebody in, but to do what? You want to go arrest al-Assad and get him out, but then someone else just takes his place? Do you want to go and, put a small number of forces in, but then, that's going to get disclosed somewhere, and you're going to have, a lot of political problems. So sort of from that theoretical standpoint, it sounds really good, but when you start putting the pieces together, how we're actually going to do it is run into those problems. And of course, anytime you do something outside of the law, you have those ramifications, because, as we're learning, you have a guy by the name of Edward Snowden who gets a job as a government contractor and then releases a whole bunch of classified information. So, it's, yeah, you can do the covert stuff, but there's always a risk.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you asked that, because I had a question I wanted to ask you that I wasn't trying to get in. And that was, you talked about after 2001, we were now able, if anybody's related to Al-Qaeda, to go. Was that the justification they used for Iraq, or like what were the legal means for?
I don't know the exact, I mean, I think they had authorization. There was an authorization to use military force for Iraq. And also, the justification, what I didn't get into, is the international law end. Right? The UN Security Council had said, look, Saddam, you've got to dump your chemical weapons, and of course, he never let anyone in to inspect. And so the ramification was, we're going to come and use force. And so the Bush administration could rely on the UN Security Council resolutions. And that's the other thing that the Obama administration was trying to do with Syria, is like, well, let's get the UN Security Council to do it. The problem was, as you guys have pointed out, you have Russia sitting there, and they have one of the 5 vetoes in the Security Council. So you could have, there's 15 members, so you could have a 14-to-1 vote, but if that one is Russia, the Security Council's not going to be able to do anything. So that was what the problem was from that end.
Yeah, and another thing with that is that, like, the chemical weapons that Syria has, even if they give them all to the international community, Iran still has chemical weapons. I mean, they've got a facility, an underground facility, that they wouldn't have let UN investigators into. I mean, that's just obvious for me, saying that they've got something down there that's pretty potent. I mean, they have top-level security around some of these sites. It's just, it's just not, the chemical weapons treaty is just not going to work.
Yeah, I have to say, if I'm the president and I'm listening to my advisors, I guess I'm assuming power to Alexander Haig. The role of the president is to act in the vital security interests of the United States. International law is such that there's not such a thing as international justice. Ergo, as international law is still a body being worked out, I say you act in accordance with what are the vital needs of the United States. That's what Clinton did as he read them in Bosnia and against Serbia. It was Milosevic who was put on trial by the International Court of Justice for war crimes. It was not Clinton. So I say, we take the legal advice, but if we take too narrow of a legal reading, we can tie our hands and we get into the pre-9/11 where we simply, we have some lawyer objecting on one basis or another, therefore we don't act on anything. So I would put that aside and I'd say there are lots of complications about taking military action in Syria that we could go further, but I think that, I wouldn't buy, in the end, the international law arguments, although I'm not, disputing your arguments about technicalities and such. So the question is intervening whether it would do good or not, and the only way intervening would do good is if the United States was willing to intervene in a way that would make change. That would require us to have a consensus that we haven't made yet. If we probably took a poll in the room, I guess my money would be that the majority would be against action. That might be from even the Hawk side, because Hawks would say, why act if you're not going to stay the course? Because you're going to just get involved, you're going to leave a mess, and you're going to walk away. But if, and that's where I would say that's the job of the president. If he saw the use of military forces being appropriate, then it's up to him to use the bully pulpit and bring together a kind of consensus. Truman did it in the Cold War, Eisenhower did it, other presidents have done it. But if we continue to see this in some very narrow light, and I'm not trying to pick on the legalistic aspect, but say just chemical weapons, or I gave you a perspective that this is the entire region. We need to sit back and think about this, because it's not just Syria. It could be Egypt tomorrow. Egypt is on the brink of a civil war with the Muslim Brotherhood outlawed and giving them no recourse if they want to act, but by using force. We can take a tour across the region. It's a powder keg. We need to, we're busy fighting budget battles and they're serious battles. We, as long as the United States walks away, the one great power really in the world still today from the region, I think we see the consequences as that allows regimes like Iran, Putin, who doesn't seem to me to be the person who has altruism as his basic motive, despite what Matthew might tell me. China, which is basically following a kind of realpolitik for Chinese interests, and is not a damn bit interested in international law. We're allowing those kinds of groups to call the shots while we sit back, because there is no way that a great power, by taking itself out, is still a policy. We're still affecting events. Obama is affecting events even when he doesn't want to be by our mere absence. So I think we need a fundamental rethinking of it. But you know, we've sort of paddled up to the rapids about going into war, and then we suddenly turned right before we went in them. And right now, I have no idea where we're headed.
Yeah, there's a really funny picture online that has a picture of a submarine shooting a missile and then says, Syria, democracy is on its way. And so the issue is that the longer we wait to, and I kind of agree with Dr. Simpson that I think at some point the legal issues are difficult, but I also think on top of that, because Syria hasn't really been an issue since until the summer, when it became a real hotbed in politics, it's become a politically divisive issue. And I think earlier on, I mean, I was really, for basically since I read a book 2 years ago, for aiding rebels in some sense or another, but I guess that's obviously harder than it sounds. But at the same time, I think we don't want to focus solely on chemical weapons. So that's kind of what's made it a hotbed right now. But chemical weapons are really one of the least of our problems in Syria. And that's saying a lot, because if Iran wins out and Rouhani gets what he wants, which is to broker this deal, then all of a sudden you're going to have a Syrian state that is an Iranian puppet. And as we were kind of talking about before, Iran is a huge threat. On the other hand, though, this is the picture the Obama administration is painting, that it's Iran or it's Al-Qaeda. And that situation only exists if we can't find a way to do something. Because again, there are plenty of groups in Syria, it's just going to be how to find them.
I'd like to just throw in a couple of comments, particularly regarding what we can do now. Russia and China's role is they have a dual role, of course, not just providing political cover for the Assad regime, but they are providing some sort of material support, particularly in regard to spare parts and ammunition for heavy weapons, tanks, aircraft, etc. The Iranians can't provide the heavy weapon support because the Syrian military doesn't carry that type. It's all Russian and Chinese, and so it is possible to carry out some sort of diplomatic initiative to try and cut back on Russian and Chinese support, which would at least weaken the regime. I mean, that has nothing to do with legal affairs, that's just international relations. I think the bigger picture problem with that is that we're not in a position to carry any credibility or a lot of credibility on the diplomatic stage as well. And this is undermining multiple efforts, not just in Syria, but elsewhere. So there are ways, and it doesn't have to be boots on the ground. There are a lot of ways in which this can be affected, but we're not carrying that policy. Any of those policies are not being done. It seems to be a frustration. And so my question to the panel is, I guess, does the administration have a coherent policy in the Middle East?
No. Absolutely not. I mean, they could launch an ICBM and take out Damascus right now, but they don't have a plan to go in after that or do.
Well, I mean, just a coherent,
yeah,
diplomatic or political policy in regards to strategy and dealing with.
Actually, I say no, but I know Dr. Simpson and I have talked about this. Obama studied under a guy named, or studied at least at Columbia, and a guy named Edward Said was there. And Edward Said's kind of one of the big proponents of America has no role in the Middle East. So I think the coherent policy the administration has is do nothing until you have to do something, and then do as little as you can.
I wonder though, is that true at all? I mean, the United States has told itself, and for centuries, that we do nothing, that we're isolationists, but that's never ever been true at all. And so I'm wondering, and I know very little too, but what is the backstory here? I don't believe for a second that the U.S. is not doing anything, right?
Oh, no.
What are we doing? And is it a diplomatic role? Is it a military role? Is it more, teaches this course on sort of exporting culture, like there's Coca-Cola in these countries. What role does American business play in all of this? Or what role does oil play? What is the interest? What really is sort of the backstory to all of this? And maybe we don't know until class documents.
No,
at least
it's
20 years, but-
no, it's a complex question. The United States is, having been in intelligence myself, I think the idea of letting the CIA handle it, from a historian's point of view, would be like a bad solution. Because usually the CIA can handle it, and blows it even when they do try to do something. But we're certainly making, I guess the problem is I think that the Obama administration's main effort has tried to be a multilateral effort. That's the critique of the Bush administration, was that they were cowboys, unilateralists, if you will. The problem with multilateralism is you have to bring consensus of the number of actors. You have to use, if you try to use the UN, you're stymied immediately by I started to say the Soviet Union, Russia, and well, Putin probably would be the Soviet Union. And China usually will get out of the way, actually, and will abstain, but both of them are undermined. I think Obama's been kind of hoist on his own petard on trying to be a multilateralist, and he's starting, for example, in the case of Iran, talking about what the policy is, he's actually backing away from a multilateral effort right now and saying that the United States is ready to make the grand bargain with Iran, and that would be to discount the other Security Council members, as well as Germany, who are if you're familiar, those are the countries that have been trying to enforce the sanctions and such on Iran. I guess we kind of have two questions out there. We got the question like, do we have a policy? And the answer is yes, but I think it's a wrong-headed policy. It's a multilateral policy. It's a policy called reach out to the region and show them that we're not really the imperialists who you've seen before, and try to gain their trust. The problem is that doesn't work. The Iranians saw Carter as the great Satan and made no differentiation between Carter and Reagan. I see them making no differentiation ultimately between Bush and Obama. It's still the Americans, and it's still kind of where they're seeing us as a monolith. So I think that his efforts, while noble, are actually being counterproductive. I wouldn't say they don't have a policy, I'd say they have an ineffective policy, and they're trying to change midstream. The other major part of our policy, which would follow the Said school, is that we see most of the problems in the Middle East stemming from the Arab-Israeli conflict, and so we have Secretary, he'd like President, but Kerry there trying to engage the Arab-Israelis in peace talk, but that is really a reductionist argument, is that all the problems stem back to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and we just named the minorities a while back in Syria, which take you that the region is much more heterogeneous, much more complex than that. It's certainly, that would be a plus, but actually there's not even any kind of objective factors to advance a peace there. So basically they're floundering for a policy right now in the region, and I'll go one step further and say that I expect them soon to reach for that grand bargain, even though they don't have it, which will essentially back off the sanctions on Iran while allowing them to pursue their nuclear program. Won't allow them necessarily to acquire nuclear weapons, but will allow them to acquire nuclear capability, which is almost the same thing. So I see us, that's kind of like pulling the rabbit out of the hat, and that's what I fear we're about to make a fundamental mistake there. And I don't want, I'm saying it and I'm going to let you guys talk again, but I don't want it to be like I'm picking on Obama, because really what I would like to see is throw away these partisan barriers and reach across, but we're getting locked up in such fundamental, we're arguing, you know, Tea Party, burning crosses, or you can take whatever side from, where the extremes are driving our arguments. And we need to wake up and smell the coffee, because the Middle East is a powder keg. And 60% of the world oil is there. There may be, if you guys who've had me for class know the word shitload of oil in Dakotas, but we're not exploiting it right now. And anyhow, that's not going to get to Europe and to Japan. So 60% of world oil, 45% of natural gas. We got to deal with the Middle East, at least in the short term. So, going on too long. Other people are getting hungry probably at this point.
I have one question I think is pretty quick. I'm having trouble seeing how we could move on Gaddafi, but we can't move on Assad. It didn't seem like that was legal either. Was it the Securities Council that allowed that? This isn't a quick question, and
Yeah,
feel
I
free
don't
to.
have much knowledge of that particular situation, but I will say, you know, he was in power a lot longer, and the things that he had done had backed up.
Stacked, okay.
You have international law that allows self-defense, as broadly as you can construe self-defense. It allows you to sort of do. So there's some preemptive self-defense probably you could throw in there. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, again, I don't know enough about it to give you a very intelligent answer.
Also, a big difference between Libya and Syria is that in Libya, the U.S. was really playing second fiddle to France and Britain, who were kind of going in.
Okay, and then they opted out this time.
Yeah. Well, France
France
did.
did.
France is good. France wants to be in there, but Britain said no, and then they're like, well, let's see where it goes, but not really.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's kind of a huge
And
difference.
I'm not the international law guy, but I would say there was substantively no difference between acting in Libya and.
Right, yeah, I didn't think there was.
The other difference is, it just sort of came to my mind, and you got, you know, al-Libi, who we just went in and grabbed from Libya and brought him out. Right? That was done with congressional authorization. They informed Congress, we're gonna go do this, and they have a certain time limit in which they can go and do it without any
The
problem.
60-day rule
So,
or whatever.
that's essentially what happens, right? We go in, it's a 3-4 hour process, go in, grab him, get out. Same thing that happened the same day or within a couple days with Somalia, right? In, try and get them up, resistance, we're not gonna stay and get engaged in something that can be longer, so let's get out.
Okay.
Yeah, you have 60 days, so, and you can give warning of it, so. In the case of the Marine Embassy, I know guys who were there when it was bombed, and the story I was told was, this was the Reagan administration, anecdotes, but when the Marine saw the truck coming loaded with explosives, he had his magazine out of his rifle in his pocket, because that was the standing order, rules of engagement, because if it was in his rifle, then there was a danger that could incite such things, so we'll keep it in our, of course, slowed him up in being, this is kind of, that is where you can go if you follow, and not, certainly not where you were meaning to take things.
Yeah, and you can respond, right, you know, using the Beirut bombing, right? The Reagan administration is allowed to respond and, you know, launch missiles and all that because it's in self-defense, it's in retaliation for what you did to us.
Right, okay.
Other questions?
I'm not sure if it's more of a question or if it's just a comment on something. that seems to come up a whole bunch with this is that we're kind of talking about the precedents we've had. We're kind of comparing it to other things. And I think it's important that we define what is different. So some places you guys have said is Libya, Iraq with the chemical weapons, Bosnia. So what is different about this that prevents us or is keeping us from agreeing on an action?
Right now, it's stayed within the borders, and these violence-wise, right, it's still a civil war, so to speak. And so, one of the things Dr. Simpson was saying was, well, it's in the U.S. vital interest, right? The U.S. can respond to its national security interests. And one of the things I think the government is having articulating is, what is our security interest in this, right? I mean, it's not like, even with the chemical weapons, right? Assad doesn't have the capability to launch those things across the Atlantic Ocean and reach the United States, and so we have to default to Israel. And so to say, all right, Israel is our security interest here, right? Or al-Nusra is our security interest here. So that's probably part of the reason, is articulating how this particular situation is a U.S. security interest.
But the Israelis have been pretty quiet on this.
Yeah,
They have
and
not spoken about it. And the missile strike was against the
Yeah,
Hezbollah.
I actually saw the two heads of AIPAC came to Cleveland, Ohio, to my synagogue where I'm back home, so I saw them speak and actually asked the question about Syria. And AIPAC's position, so even though that's not necessarily Israel, is that while they think going into Syria and taking Assad out is great, it would be great, they would worry that if it would prevent the U.S. from ever acting on Iran itself. So if Iran did get weapons or continue to develop, that Syria would be more of a distraction. So that was their response.
The Israelis are not concerned about Syria.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
I had one more. Possible way we can help that wasn't really addressed. Jordan touched a whole bunch on the refugee situation, that these massive outpouring into the region in Turkey and Saudi Arabia. But it's interesting that there hasn't been an outpouring to the United States, that there hasn't been a major outpouring. The last I read, there's only been like 5,000 refugees, which compared to these other countries.
It's up 2,000 this week, but yeah,
2,000.
yeah, so it's 7,000 now.
Yeah, so, I mean, but even that seems like dramatically lower numbers. Would us opening our borders and going in there to, I guess, pull more refugees out, is that something that's viable?
The refugee problem is overwhelming, and I think the refugees would wish to return to their homes. So I don't think that's, I mean, being willing to take in more refugees is certainly a realistic policy, humanitarian policy, but it's not going to be one that would fundamentally alter the problem. There's other ways to help in that, making sure that there's plenty of medicine and humanitarian kind of food aid and those kinds of things. People are starving or very hungry in Syria right now. But you wanted to say something.
Yeah, it brings up another one because we do have regular humanitarian support through the Red Cross in there. And I've heard reports, I didn't get logistics for it, but about US citizens working with the Red Cross who are being kidnapped and who are being targeted for being US citizens. So how does that change it? That if we send all this humanitarian support into this country and they're acting as US citizens trying to help out, and they begin to be targeted, what then can the US do?
Well, there's the Red Crescent, there's a number of indigenous kind of groups, so it doesn't have to necessarily be Americans bringing that aid in ourselves. We can take it right to the, there's no reason not to trust, say, the Jordanians or the Turks on that kind of thing.
I understand, but I'm saying we actually do have our US citizens who are in the country, and they're going to continue to enter it through our private rescue organizations. So how do we protect their lives, their interests? And if
They're going into harm's way, that's
Yeah.
simply it.
Oh, I remember stories of journalists being killed in Syria, and the countries condemned the attacks, but they really don't have the jurisdiction to stop them. There's sanctions and travel warnings all over, everywhere saying, don't go into Syria. I know a CNN journalist went into Syria, and he had to cross illegally, and he was under heavy disease.
Yeah, you don't want the humanitarian aid to become an instrument by which we're going to protect this ambulance with, an army. So, I mean, I mean, at a certain level, they assume the risk on it. But one thing I think you guys have heard at least, that there are a host of measures that can be applied to deal with Syria, short of dropping nuclear weapons on them or being totally absent. That there is, economic, legal, diplomatic, military, there's a whole host of weapons in our arsenal, and that kind of went towards what Dr. Buich was talking about. Some of those are being applied, but I think haphazardly.
Just for fun, again, not the practicality of it, U.S. law makes it a crime for someone in another country to kill a U.S. citizen who is in that country. So if you have someone from the Red Cross who's an American citizen and they're targeted and tries to kill them, well, at least in theory, we have some basis for going in and investigating and bringing them back here and prosecuting them for, again, whatever practical good that has.
Last call.
Escape.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, panel.